The winter of 1947 came to Warsaw like a gray hand, closing over the city's broken face. Snow fell through the holes where rooftops used to be. It settled on the rubble where families had lived, where children had laughed before the world learned to scream. The war had ended 2 years before, but the wounds were still fresh, still bleeding into the cold ground. Józef Kowalski walked through these wounds every morning on his way to work. He was 34 years old, thin as paper, with eyes that had seen too much and hands that shook when he thought no one was looking. The government had given him a job sorting through the remains of the old world. An archivist, they called him, a keeper of what was left behind. The building where he worked had once been the Municipal Children's Hospital. Before that, it had been something else. The records were unclear or perhaps deliberately obscured. The locals whispered that it had been a place where troubled children went to get better. But the whispers were old and soft, like leaves that had fallen so long ago they had become part of the earth. The bombing had taken the upper floors completely. Only the basement remained whole, filled with filing cabinets that stood like metal tombstones in the dark. Józef's job was simple: organize what could be saved, burn what could not. The state wanted to know what had happened in places like this, wanted to catalog the past so it could build a better future. But Józef had learned that some past did not want to be cataloged. On this particular Tuesday, the coldest day of the month, Józef found something that should not have existed. He was working in the deepest part of the basement, in a room that felt older than the building itself. The walls were thick stone, older than the brick and mortar above. They belonged to something that had been there before the hospital, before the children, before anyone remembered what had come first. The filing cabinet in the corner had been stuck for weeks. The metal had warped in the bombing, and the drawers refused to open. But on this day, as Józef pulled with both hands, something gave way. The bottom drawer slid open with a sound like a sigh, as if it had been holding its breath all this time. Inside, beneath a layer of dust thick as felt, lay a single leather journal. Józef lifted it carefully. The leather was dark brown, soft as skin that had never seen the sun. It was bound with thick thread that looked almost organic, as if it had grown from the book itself rather than being sewn by human hands. The thread was a deep red color that seemed to shift in the light, sometimes appearing black, sometimes the color of dried blood. The journal was warm to the touch. Józef opened it slowly, half expecting the pages to crumble at his touch. But the paper was strong, cream-colored, and smooth. The writing was in Polish, written with a careful hand that belonged to someone who had taken time with words, who had believed that what he was writing mattered. The first entry was dated December 15th, 1934. Today, 12 children arrived from the city. They came in winter, as they always do. The winter children are different from the others. They carry the cold inside them, but also something else. Something that connects them to each other and to this place in ways that science cannot yet explain. I have been appointed as their physician. Dr. Edmund Vasek, they call me, though I wonder sometimes if names matter in a place like this. The children do not speak much, but they watch everything. They watch each other, and they watch me, and I feel that they see things that others cannot see. I believe that what we call madness is often just connection to things that most people have learned to ignore. These children have not learned to ignore. They see the threads that bind us all together, and sometimes I think they can pull on those threads. Józef felt his hands begin to shake as he read. There was something about the words that made his skin crawl, but he could not stop reading. It was like looking into deep water, frightening, but impossible to look away from. He turned the page. December 22nd, 1934, the boy they call Thomas can make flowers grow in winter. I found him in the garden this morning, kneeling in the snow with his bare hands pressed against the frozen ground. Where his palms touched, small white flowers pushed up through the ice. They were beautiful and impossible, and when I asked him how he did it, he looked at me with those strange, old eyes and said, "They were always there, doctor. I just helped them remember." The girl Anna draws pictures of people she has never met. But when I showed her drawings to the staff, 3 of them recognized the faces as relatives who had died years before. Anna draws them exactly as they were in life, down to the smallest details. A scar on a cheek, the way someone held their hands when they were thinking. She draws them with love, as if she knows them, as if she misses them. I am beginning to understand that this place is not what it appears to be. It is not just a hospital for troubled children. It is something else, something older. The children are not here to be cured. They are here because this is where they belong, where their gifts can grow without fear. The words seemed to blur before Yosef's eyes. The basement around him felt colder, as if something had sucked all the warmth from the air. He could hear his own breathing, quick and shallow in the silence. He turned to the next entry, and the next. Each one told of children who could do impossible things. Children who spoke to the dead, who could see through walls, who could touch your hand and know your deepest secrets. Dr. Vasek wrote about them with the careful attention of a scientist, but also with something else. Love, perhaps, or fear. As Yosef read, he began to understand that Dr. Vasek had not been trying to cure these children. He had been trying to protect them. The world outside was growing darker, more violent. War was coming, though it would not arrive for several more years. But the doctor had seen it coming, had felt it in the air like a storm approaching. January 30th, 1935, I have made a decision that may damn us all, or save us. The children are stronger when they are together. Their abilities feed off each other, grow and multiply like light reflecting between mirrors. But they are also vulnerable when separated. The world outside grows crueler each day, and I fear what will happen to children like these when the darkness finally comes. I have found a way to connect them more deeply. It requires sacrifice, but I believe it is the only way to keep them safe. They will become part of this place, and this place will become part of them. They will never truly leave, but they will never truly be gone either. God forgive me for what I am about to do. The entries after that became harder to read. The handwriting grew more frantic, more desperate. Dr. Vasek wrote about procedures that sounded more like rituals than medicine, about connections that went deeper than blood, deeper than bone. He wrote about children who stopped aging, who became part of the building itself, whose voices could still be heard in the walls long after their bodies had faded away. The final entry was dated March 13th, 1935. It is finished. The children are safe now, safer than they ever could have been in the world above. They exist in the spaces between, in the quiet places where love and memory meet. They will wait here until the world is ready for them again, until humanity learns to see the threads that connect us all. I will stay with them, of course. I am their guardian now, their keeper. When others come looking, and they will come, someday, I will be here to explain, to help them understand that some things are more important than life, more lasting than death. The war is coming. I can feel it like a fever in the air. But the children will survive it, will outlast it. They will outlast all of us. And perhaps, when the world has learned to be gentle again, they will return. Yosef closed the journal with hands that would not stop shaking. The basement around him felt different now, charged with something he could not name. The shadows seemed deeper, more alive. The silence felt like it was listening. He looked around the room with new eyes, wondering what else might be hidden in these walls, what other secrets might be waiting in the dark. The journal had spoken of children who had become part of the building itself, who existed in the spaces between life and death, between memory and dream. And as he sat there in the cold basement, surrounded by the remains of forgotten lives, Yosef began to wonder if those children might still be here, waiting in the walls, watching from the shadows with those strange, old eyes that saw too much and understood even more. The spring of 1935 came late to the children's ward, and when it finally arrived, it brought no warmth. Dr. Helena Nowak walked between the 11 small beds each morning, watching life drain from bodies too young to understand why they had been abandoned by the world. These were not the special children that Dr. Vasek had written about in his journal. These were simply forgotten ones, left behind when their families could no longer bear the weight of caring for broken things. Helena was 42 years old, with silver threading through her dark hair and hands that had delivered hundreds of babies into a world that seemed to grow crueler with each passing year. She had worked at the hospital for 15 years, had seen children come and go like seasons. But these 11 had been here for almost 2 years now, and in all that time, not one visitor had come to see them. They were dying of loneliness. That was not the medical term, of course. The charts spoke of malnutrition, of weakened immune systems, of failure to thrive. But Helena knew the truth that medicine could not name. Some people died not from disease, but from the simple absence of love. The children grew thinner each day, their eyes growing larger in their pale faces, as if they were already becoming ghosts. Anna was the smallest, barely 7 years old, with hair so blonde it was almost white. She had been born with a twisted spine, and her parents had left her the hospital when she was 3 days old. She never cried, never asked for anything, just lay in her bed watching the ceiling as if she could see something there that others could not. Thomas was 9, the oldest of them, with dark eyes that held too much knowledge for a child. His parents had died in a factory fire, and he had been brought to the hospital with burns on his hands that had healed but left scars like spider webs across his palms. He was the one who spoke for the others, though he rarely spoke at all. There was Maria, who had been born deaf and whose family had decided she was useless. There was Pavel, whose legs would never work properly, and Sophia, whose mind worked in ways that frightened adults. There were 6 others, each carrying their own burden, each abandoned for being different in a world that demanded sameness. Helena loved them all with a fierce, protective love that sometimes kept her awake at night. She would lie in her small apartment above the hospital, listening to the wind move through the broken windows, and think about how unfair it was that children should suffer for the fears of grown-ups. It was on a Tuesday in early May when she noticed that Anna had stopped eating entirely. The child lay in her bed like a small broken bird, her breathing so shallow that Helena had to put her ear close to Anna's chest to hear her heart still beating. When Helena tried to give her soup, Anna turned her head away, as if she had already decided to let go. That night, Helena sat beside Anna's bed and held her tiny hand. The child's fingers were cold, so cold that Helena wondered if the life had already begun to leave them. She looked around the ward at the other 10 children, all of them sleeping the thin sleep of the dying, and felt something break inside her chest. "You don't have to be alone," she whispered to Anna. "None of you have to be alone." The idea came to her slowly, like dawn breaking over a dark landscape. She had been reading Dr. Vasek's journal, the one that had been found in the basement. She had read about the special children, about connections that ran deeper than blood, about threads that bound souls together across the spaces between life and death. What if she could give these dying children what they needed most? What if she could give them each other truly and completely, so that they would never be alone again? Helena had always been good with a needle. Her grandmother had taught her to sew when she was a child, had shown her how thread could bind things together, how the right stitch could make 2 pieces of cloth become one. She had used those skills to mend clothes, to close wounds, to repair the small tears that life made in the fabric of everyday things. But this would be different. This would be deeper. She spent 3 days preparing. She gathered red thread from the hospital supply room, the kind used for surgical procedures, strong and made to last inside the human body. She found 11 small silver needles, each one blessed by the priest who came to give last rites to the dying. She read Dr. Vasek's journal again and again, trying to understand what he had meant when he wrote about connections that went beyond flesh and bone. On Friday night, when the hospital was quiet and the other staff had gone home, Helena began her work. She started with Anna, the smallest and weakest. She took the child's tiny hand and whispered words of comfort as she made a small cut on Anna's palm with the silver needle. The blood that came was bright red, more alive-looking than the child had seemed in weeks. Helena soaked the thread in that blood, whispering a prayer that was part medicine and part magic. Then she moved to Thomas, sleeping in the bed next to Anna's. She made the same small cut, let the same red thread drink his blood. And then, with hands that shook only slightly, she began to sew. The thread went from Anna's palm to Thomas's palm, connecting them with stitches so small they were almost invisible. As she worked, Helena felt something change in the air around the children. Their breathing seemed to synchronize, their heartbeats finding the same rhythm. Anna's color began to improve almost immediately. Helena moved to Maria next, then to Pavel, then to Sophia. One by one, she connected each child to the others with a red thread, creating a web of connection that spread across the ward like a net made of love and blood and desperate hope. The children did not wake during the procedure, but they smiled in their sleep. Their faces, which had been growing thinner and paler each day, began to fill out. Their breathing grew stronger, their heartbeats steadier. The thread that connected them pulsed with a soft, warm light that only Helena could see. When she finished, just as the sun was beginning to rise, Helena looked at what she had created. 11 children, no longer dying alone, bound together by something stronger than blood, deeper than bone. They were connected now in ways that science could not explain, sharing strength and love and the simple, vital knowledge that they were not alone in the world. Anna opened her eyes first, and when she looked at Helena, she smiled. The first smile Helena had ever seen on the child's face. "We're together now," Anna whispered, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "All of us." The other children began to wake, one by one, and Helena saw that Anna was right. They were together now in ways that went beyond physical proximity. They shared dreams, shared thoughts, shared the burden of pain and the joy of healing. They had become something new, something that the world had never seen before. But as Helena watched them, she began to understand that what she had done could not be undone, that the connection she had created would last far beyond these small bodies, far beyond this life. And in the growing light of morning, as the children laughed together for the first time in their lives, Helena wondered if she had saved them or condemned them to something far more complex than simple death. The thread that bound them would hold them together through whatever came next, but she was beginning to understand that some bonds were too strong for the world to bear. The autumn of 1939 came to Lublin with the sound of boots on cobblestone and the smell of smoke in the air. Helena Nowak stood at the window of the children's ward, watching gray uniforms march through the streets below. The war had finally arrived for years after Dr. Vasek had predicted it, and it wore the face of young men with empty eyes and orders they followed without question. The hospital had been marked for closure. All the children were to be moved to other facilities, scattered across the country like seeds thrown to the wind. But Helena knew what that meant for her 11 special ones. Children like these, broken, different, connected in ways that frightened people, would not survive in the camps they called hospitals. They would disappear, become numbers and ledgers that no one would ever read. She had kept them safe for 4.5 years since that night, when she had sewn them together with red thread and desperate love. They had grown, though not in the way other children grew. Their bodies remained small, delicate as birds, but their minds had expanded in ways that defied understanding. They shared thoughts now, shared dreams, shared the deep knowledge of each other's hearts. Anna, still the smallest at 11 years old, could see through Thomas's eyes when she closed her own. Maria, though born deaf, could hear the songs that Sophia hummed in her sleep 3 beds away. Pavel's legs had never worked, but through the thread that bound him to the others, he could run through meadows in dreams they all shared. They were no longer 11 separate children dying alone. They had become something new, something that the world was not ready to accept. The soldiers came on a Tuesday morning in October. Helena watched them climb the hospital steps, their faces hard as winter stone. She knew she had very little time. She gathered the children around Anna's bed, the center of their web, where the red threads were strongest. They came without being called, moving in the strange, synchronized way they had developed over the years. They knew, as she did, that this was the end of something. "They want to take you away," Helena said, her voice steady though her heart was breaking. "They want to separate you." Anna looked up at her with those pale, knowing eyes. "We can't be separated, Dr. Nowak. The thread won't let us." Helena knelt beside the bed and took Anna's hand. The scars from the needle were still visible on the child's palm, faded but permanent, like tiny star-shaped birthmarks that connected her to the others. "I know, little one, but they don't understand that." Thomas stepped forward, his dark eyes serious. He was 15 now, the oldest, though he looked no older than 12. The others looked to him when decisions needed to be made, though Helena knew the real decisions came from all of them together, through the thread that linked their thoughts. "We've been talking about this," Thomas said, "in the quiet place where we all meet. We know what happens to children like us when the soldiers come." Helena felt tears begin to well in her eyes. "You're just children. You shouldn't have to know about such things. We stopped being just children the night you sewed us together," Anna said gently. "We became something else, something that can choose." The sound of boots echoed in the hallway outside. Voices shouted orders in the harsh language that had become the sound of occupation. Helena heard her name being called, heard demands that she bring the children down to the trucks that were waiting. "What will you choose?" Helena whispered. The 11 children looked at each other, and Helena saw something pass between them that was deeper than words, deeper than thought. It was the connection she had created, the thread that had grown stronger with each passing year, until it was no longer just surgical thread, but something alive, something that pulsed with shared heartbeat and shared purpose. "We choose to stay together," Thomas said. "Forever." Anna began to sing then, a lullaby in a voice so pure it seemed to come from somewhere beyond the small, broken body that contained it. Helena recognized the melody. It was something her own grandmother had sung to her when she was very young, a song about children who became stars so they would never be alone in the dark. One by one, the other children joined in. Their voices blended in harmonies that should have been impossible for children who had never learned to sing together. But they had learned through the thread, through the connection that let them share everything, including the memory of lullabies their mothers had sung before abandoning them to this place. Helena watched in wonder and growing horror as the children's bodies began to fade. It started with their fingers and toes, becoming transparent like water, like glass, like morning mist. But their voices remained strong, grew stronger, as if the songs were all that was left of them. The soldiers burst through the door just as Anna's physical form dissolved entirely. Her voice still filled the room, still led the chorus of lullabies, but her body had become something that existed in the spaces between visible and invisible, between alive and dead. One by one, the other children followed her. Thomas last of all, his dark eyes meeting Helena's as his face became translucent, then gone. "Remember us," his voice whispered from the air itself. "Remember that we were loved." The soldiers stood in the doorway, their weapons raised, staring at 11 empty beds. They shouted at Helena in their harsh language, demanding to know where the children had gone. But Helena could only stand there, tears streaming down her face, listening to the voices that still filled the room with songs of comfort and connection. The commanding officer struck her across the face, splitting her lip. He shouted that she had hidden the children, that she would be punished for defying orders. But Helena barely felt the blow. She was listening to the music that came from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls themselves, from the red thread that still connected 11 souls who had chosen love over survival. The soldiers searched the room, tore apart the beds, looked in every closet and corner. But there was nothing to find. The children had become part of the building itself, woven into its bones by the thread that Helena had used to bind them together. They existed now in the quiet spaces, in the shadows between shadows, in the songs that would echo through these walls long after the war had ended. As the soldiers dragged Helena away, she heard Anna's voice one last time, clear and sweet and eternal. "Thank you for showing us how to never be alone." The hospital fell silent then, except for the wind through broken windows and the distant sound of marching feet. But in that silence, something waited. 11 voices joined in endless harmony, 11 souls connected by red thread and desperate love, holding vigil in the spaces where memory and dreams intersect. They had chosen to become something the world could not touch, could not separate, could not destroy. They had chosen to become legend. The summer of 1963 found Józef Kowalski on a train to Lublin, carrying Dr. Wasek's journal in a leather satchel that had once belonged to his father. 16 years had passed since that cold December morning when he first opened the journal in the basement of the ruined hospital. 16 years of sleepless nights, of questions that had no answers, of a story that refused to let him rest. The world had moved on, as worlds do. Poland was rebuilding itself from the ashes of the war, creating new buildings where old ones had fallen, new lives where old ones had been lost. People spoke of the future now, of progress and hope, and forgetting the dark years that had nearly destroyed them all. But Józef could not forget. The journal had become part of him, like a second heartbeat, like a voice that whispered in his dreams. He was 50 now, his hair gone gray at the temples, his hands marked with the small scars that came from years of handling old papers and broken glass. The government had given him a new job after the hospital archives were completed, organizing records in the Ministry of Health, cataloging the bureaucratic remains of a country that was learning to breathe again. But the work felt hollow after what he had discovered in that basement. How could filing reports about vaccination schedules matter when he carried the weight of 11 children's souls in his memory? The journal had become his obsession. He had read every word 100 times, had memorized the careful handwriting of Dr. Wasek and the increasingly frantic entries about children who could do impossible things. He had researched the doctor's background, traced his education and career through dusty archives and yellowing records. Edmund Wasek had been real, a respected physician who had worked at several hospitals before disappearing in 1935, the same year his final journal entry was dated. But it was the children Józef really wanted to understand. Were they real too? Or had Dr. Wasek been a madman writing fantasies in a book bound with thread that felt too much like skin? Józef had spent years trying to find any official record of them. Birth certificates, hospital admissions, anything that would prove they had existed beyond the pages of the journal. He had found nothing. No records of Anna with the twisted spine, or Thomas with his burned hands, or any of the others. It was as if they had never been born, never lived, never died. As if they existed only in the space between Dr. Wasek's imagination and Józef's growing belief that some truths were too strange for official documents to hold. The train pulled into Lublin station on a Thursday morning when the sun was bright and the air smelled of new construction and old memories. The city had been rebuilt after the war, but Józef could still see the scars if he knew where to look. Buildings that were too new, streets that curve around empty lots where other streets had once been, churches with walls that didn't quite match where bombs had torn them open and human hands had sewn them back together. He found the site where the children's hospital had once stood. There was a school there now, built in a modern style with clean lines and large windows that let in plenty of light. Children played in the courtyard during their lunch break, their laughter bright and ordinary in the summer air. Józef stood at the fence and watched them, wondering if any of them could do the things Dr. Wasek had written about, if any of them could make flowers grow in winter or draw pictures of people they had never met. But these children looked normal, healthy, loved. They had families waiting for them at home, futures stretched out ahead of them like roads leading to better places. They were nothing like the abandoned ones who had filled the beds of the old hospital, nothing like the 11 who had been bound together by red thread and desperate love. Józef spent 3 days in Lublin, walking through the rebuilt streets and talking to old people who might remember the hospital from before the war. Most of them had stories about the place, how it had been bombed, how the patients had been evacuated or simply disappeared. But no one remembered anything about special children, about Dr. Wasek, about the strange events that the journal described in such careful detail. On his final day, as he was preparing to return to Warsaw empty-handed, Józef found himself in the old section of the city, where a few buildings had survived the war intact. There was a small church there, St. Catherine's, with stone walls that had weathered centuries and a cemetery behind it that was older than anyone could remember. The priest was a young man, too young to have been there during the war, but he was friendly and curious about Yosef's research. He led Yosef through the church's records, showing him burial registers and baptismal certificates that went back to the 18th century. They found nothing about the hospital or Dr. Vasek or any unusual children. But as they were closing the record books, the priest mentioned something that made Yosef's heart stop. "There is one strange thing," the young man said, almost apologetically. "In the cemetery, in the old section near the back wall, there's a grave marker there that's always puzzled me. It has 11 names on it, all children, but they're all listed under a single surname, Nowak. And the dates are wrong. They all died on the same day, in 1939, but they were born years apart. Some of them would have been adults by then, but the marker lists them as children." Yosef's hands began to shake. Nowak. Like Dr. Helena Nowak, the physician who had worked at the children's hospital. He had found references to her in other records, had learned that she had been arrested by German soldiers in October 1939 and had died in custody 3 days later. "Can you show me?" Yosef asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The priest led him through the cemetery, past rows of weathered headstones and crumbling mausoleums, to a corner where old graves lay beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree. There, almost hidden by tall grass and forgotten by time, stood a simple stone marker. Carved into the gray stone were 11 names: Anna Nowak, Thomas Nowak, Maria Nowak, Pavel Nowak, Sophia Nowak, and 6 others. All of them listed as children of Dr. Helena Nowak. All of them died October 17, 1939. But at the bottom of the stone, in smaller letters, was an inscription that made Yosef's blood run cold. They chose to remain together, bound by love stronger than death. Yosef knelt in the grass and touched the stone with trembling fingers. The names were real. The children were real. Everything in Dr. Vasek's journal, everything that seemed like madness or fantasy, had been truth. The priest stood behind him, curious but respectful. "Do you know who they were?" Yosef looked up at the young man, seeing his kind face framed by the green leaves of the oak tree, and wondered how to explain a story that was too strange for the daylight world to accept. How could he tell this priest about children who had been sewn together with red thread, who had chosen to become something beyond human understanding rather than face separation and death? They were children who were loved, Yosef said finally. Children who found a way to never be alone. He stayed by the grave until evening, reading the names over and over, feeling the weight of Dr. Vasek's journal in his satchel like a heart that beat in rhythm with his own. The sun set behind the church spire, casting long shadows across the cemetery, and still Yosef knelt there, understanding finally that his search had not been about proving whether the story was real. It had been about honoring the memory of 11 children who had been abandoned by the world, but had found each other, who had been bound together by a love so desperate it had transcended death itself. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Yosef realized that he had become part of their story now, another thread in the web that connected their past to the present. And somewhere in the darkness, he thought he could hear the faint sound of children singing lullabies that their mothers had taught them before forgetting them forever.